Now it's time for one of my absolute favorite song tales. This is There's a Hole in the Bucket, adapted by John M. Feierabend and illustrated by Marissa Madonna. Now, when I've always sung the song before, I kind of envision it as a wife and her husband, but this illustrator has decided to go with the bigger sister and the little brother. You might notice I sing some of the words slightly differently from the book, but that's because I'm just so used to my version, but I really like the illustrations anyway. Oh, and I do lots of funny voices for this one. There's our title page. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Well then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well then fix it, dear Henry, fix it. With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, with what shall I fix it, dear Liza, with what? With a straw, dear Henry, with a straw, dear Henry, a straw. But the straw is too long, dear Liza, but the straw is too long, dear Liza, it's too long. Well then cut it, dear Henry, well then cut it, dear Henry, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what? With the knife, dear Henry, with the knife, dear Henry, a knife. But the knife is too dull, dear Liza, but the knife is too dull, dear Liza, it's too dull. Well then sharpen it, dear Henry, well then sharpen it, dear Henry, sharpen it. With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what? With the stone, dear Henry, with the stone, dear Henry, a stone. But the stone is too dry, dear Liza, but the stone, it's too dry, dear Liza, it's too dry. Well then wet it, dear Henry, well then wet it, dear Henry, wet it. But with what shall I wet it, dear Liza, well with what shall I wet it, dear Liza, with what? With water, dear Henry, with water, dear Henry, water. In what shall I get it, dear Liza, in what shall I get it, dear Liza, in what? In the bucket, dear Henry, in the bucket, dear Henry, the bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. There's the music, and that's the end. I'll have some questions for you about this when we see each other next time. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.